Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Beyond the Pitch podcast. Today we're joined by Mark from Willow Grove Consultants. We'll kick off straight away with the first question about a bit about your background, where you started and how you started moving your services towards elite athletes and specifically women's football.
I'm Mark McGuigan. I'm a mental health occupational therapist by background. I qualified a long time ago, back in 2010. And I spent, I suppose, every minute since then in my professional career working in mental health settings. I spent a significant chunk of my time working in secure mental health services, a couple of years working with adults, and then about 6 or 7 years working with kids from sort of 8 to 18 in secure mental health settings. Then moved into more sort of community-based mental health in recent years. But in terms of the sport side of things, I've always had this idea of getting occupational therapy within elite sport environments, and I always had this idea around supporting players. Football was the thing that really came to mind, but it was supporting footballers when they experience an injury. And as an occupational therapist, when we talk about occupation, we don't mean a job. We mean any meaningful activity, anything that's important, that's purposeful. And then for whatever reason, if you're prevented from doing that, it can have a huge impact upon your physical health and your mental health. So the obvious one for me was, an ACL injury. Someone's out, and we always say it'll be 9 months, but it very, very rarely is. So we're looking at probably 12 months where you're not doing the thing that you love. And I remember hearing an interview with a player who described what it was like when they were going through that sort of period of rehabilitation. And they talked about the isolation from teammates. They also talked about the difficulties just in terms of having to be at home for extended periods of time. And there was a throwaway comment where they said, "Oh, this is very depressing." And I thought, "Oh, that sounds very similar to the experiences of the clients that I was working with in those secure inpatient facilities." So I had this idea of developing some guidance, some guidelines for players and for clubs as to how individuals could be supported during that extended period of absence through injury. And I suppose naively, I thought, I'll just send this off to some clubs and they'll say, "Come and work with us." And I actually sent it to pretty much every professional club in the country. Said, I call it the injured athlete pathway. And I said, "Here you go. You could do this. You don't even need me. The instructions are all there." And there's a very limited response, unfortunately, which felt, I suppose, quite frustrating from my perspective, because I'm saying, there's a significant risk of a decline in someone's mental health, and when they're injured, here's some things that could possibly help. Proactive strategies, reactive strategies, you can do them within your existing staff and structures, and the vast majority of clubs didn't respond. So started just reaching out to individual athletes, and a lot of it was athletes who maybe they'd posted, or that there'd been some stuff in the media around maybe their own mental health challenges where they'd come out and discussed it quite openly. So I just thought I'd be a bit cheeky and I would start reaching out to these individual athletes, whether it was Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, those types of forums, and started to get in touch with a few athletes. And the general consensus was that the vast majority of these players or athletes were towards the end of their career or had just retired, and they felt that they were able to talk about these things, because what I found in the time since is athletes are really reluctant to explore mental health support or even talk about it for fear of not getting contracts, being dropped by sponsors, those types of things. So these athletes I was speaking to from a range of sports, the consensus was that if they had have had that type of support that I was maybe suggesting when they were still maybe earlier in their career or still competing, they would have found it really, really helpful during those periods of injury and rehabilitation. Because when you're an elite athlete, you're not going to get through your career like unscathed. There will be times where you're out injured. But what I found was, and in terms of female sport, the individuals I was reaching out to, and I was reaching out to males and females, generally it was the female athletes who were more receptive to having those discussions. And then over time started to develop some I suppose, relationships, whether it was with individual players or whether it was with sporting organizations, clubs. And again, it was sort of female orientated sort of sports, or female orientated environments or female clubs that were more receptive to having those discussions. And I've now got like sort of close working relations with relationships with a number of sort of top flight clubs. But they tend to be, and like I say, maybe by accident rather than design, they tend to be the female clubs who are their doors are open to allow someone like myself to come in to provide that support. So yeah, it's a bit of a whistle stop tour of my journey into elite sport over the last few years. It's probably been about 5 years now that I've been working directly in sport.
So yeah, I mean, you also mentioned the challenges that female footballers experience, and also the ACL injury and the ACL injury crisis that we're experiencing right now. But what would you say are especially specific mental health challenges that female footballers or female athletes experience more than men do, or just in general?
I think the key thing that we would be seeing would be difficulties relating to depression and anxiety. And I think they can be exacerbated by a lot of the difficulties that are, I suppose, unfortunately far too common within women's football. So that low pay or no pay. Like I've worked with athletes playing at a really, really high level who were lucky if they were getting their expenses covered. Like I know of athletes who maybe working in sort of big cities and sort of really like high stress jobs and being expected to train 3-4 nights a week and then lose their entire weekend to maybe traveling to a away game at the other side of the country. The poor job security as well. That's a massive one. Particularly if, I suppose, if you maybe go outside sort of maybe the top 2 tiers within women's football, the contract situation is, you wouldn't believe some of the horror stories that I've come across in terms of players not being informed that, clubs have still like held on to the registration and made it very, very difficult for them and not paying them what they're owed. The other thing as well is in terms of if someone is injured, the lack of support around that. And there's, I suppose, the medical support as well, in terms of, like, we see it far too often where people are having to crowdfund for their own ACL surgery and those types of things. But it's things like players going on trial at sort of elite clubs and not even being insured while they're on those sort of trials as well. And like I wouldn't ride a bicycle without insurance, never mind like going to try and play football at a really high level. So there's those types of things which can have a huge impact upon mental health. And like I said, the key things that we would be seeing around depression and anxiety. But what we tend to do is we would do like a sort of really comprehensive formulation with an individual to find out, what's going on. Is it football related, sport related? Is it just life in general? Because what we can often find is, or what we can often forget, is that these athletes, although they're like unbelievable athletes, they're human beings just like the rest of us. And sometimes it's very, very easy to oversee that and sort of forget that. Given that these are really high profile individuals, like we're seeing them on the TV and really, really high profile, and it's easy to think these individuals are invincible, but they are just human beings. Another thing that we're starting to see quite a lot of is people with like undiagnosed autism, ADHD, or people who are being diagnosed sort of later in life. And maybe it's one of the benefits with some of the clubs where they have really clued up medical departments who are saying, oh, there might be a little issue here, let's explore, can we support you? And what I would be at pains to point out is that although there are a lot of clubs who are doing it very, very badly, there are a lot of clubs who are doing it really, really well. And I know of clubs funding like autism assessments, ADHD assessments for their players, and making sure that they get the specialist, robust support that is needed. But like I said, the key things for our organisation would be depression and anxiety.
So I'll basically, like, obviously I've spoke to you before, and you know that I used to play as well. And so my question is kind of similar to what I feel like I went through as well. And I suppose since England have won the Euros, we all know that women's football has just catapulted. But it's obviously still not at the stage where we want it to be, and it's still growing, but that'll take time. And obviously, have you seen that there's been an increase kind of an interest in your services from women's teams specifically since the sport has gone bigger? Because I found that the more higher I climbed on the ladder, I actually started to feel more anxious about how I was as a player. And so I wondered do you get kind of more interest from teams who are higher up the ladder, or do you work with women's teams across the full spectrum?
So I suppose, and again, it's very much anecdotally, it's only in my experience, but what I tend to see is it's split quite evenly between those at I suppose the highest level and those at grassroots level. So it might be a case that maybe because clubs are approaching me and saying we want to have like general support in place, and when there's something like that in place, then you offer it. It's that idea that if you've got a service available to you, you're likely to use it. But then, like you say, since women's football has blown up, particularly with England winning the Euros, I think there's more of a focus on it. But I also think a lot of those, particularly the Lionesses, there's been a huge focus on mental health as well. And with a lot of those players coming out and talking about their own experiences. And for some of them it was around injury, but people who were really open. I've taken people like Beth Mead talking about bereavement and then the challenges that came with that they're removing that sort of taboo that exists. And then, like I said, there's sort of that natural interest in the Lionesses and the mental health side of things. We've started to see like sort of spikes in sort of referrals or people contacting us. Sometimes it's just people who just are interested in what we're doing and they're just curious, and we're always more than happy to have a chat. But sometimes it's maybe people are maybe concerned about their own mental health, or of a family member or a teammate who will get in touch. But yeah, there's definitely been a significant increase. Like I said, I started out in about 2019, and it started out with me having to sort of approach clubs and individuals, but it's now the other way around, where clubs and individuals. And what we're also seeing a lot is that contact is being made by staff of these organizations, these clubs, who and sometimes it's responsive, sometimes it may be that there's a player who they're concerned about and they want some sort of support because maybe it falls outside their sort of area of expertise. But sometimes it's that we've got some staff who are working in these organizations who are unbelievable. They're really proactive, and they want to have support in place before it's needed. And it's that idea that prevention is always better than cure. But yeah, I suppose to go back to the question, like we see quite a sort of even split between that sort of the grassroots level and the elite. And maybe the bit where we probably need a bit more is the bit in between, where there's those people who are maybe semi-pro, or they're, like you say, they're lucky if they're getting their expenses covered. Because I think for me, if you're going and you're playing grassroots level, you're playing a bit of five-a-side, or you're playing sort of on a Saturday or Sunday, you're probably aware that if you get injured, that's, I suppose there's more of an obligation of you to sort of to deal with that. The difficulty is if you're playing for a top flight club, maybe who are affiliated to sort of a men's Premier League side, for example, you would maybe naively, as I was, assume that, oh, if I get injured I'll be looked after here, but it's not the case. And like, you wouldn't believe that some of the horror stories that I've come across, people at these top clubs who just aren't being looked after.
It's really interesting that you say, you see it across all levels of football. And as you mentioned, with the growth of football at the moment since the Euros, would you say that now that these teams are open to more scrutiny on social media, online, their presence is more well known, would you say that that is feeding into some of the causes of mental health issues? Seeing, players have openly said themselves that they see everything that gets posted about them, whether it's a good game or a bad game. Do you think that that is also a cause for the mental health challenges, as well as some of the other things that you mentioned about injuries and things like that?
Yeah, I think it's a massive part of it. And a lot of my clients, like there's times where I've supported clients where there's maybe they've not had a great game, or maybe there's been an incident on the pitch, and we would say just delete the apps. Like, just there's no point, because it's of no benefit to your mental health to go and read those things. But equally, there's times where I've worked with clients who've had a brilliant game, and then they've said, oh, I've been on Twitter and I've read some comments, and it's really impacted them. It's put them in like a really, really dark place. So we would encourage people to use social media really mindfully, and just be really, I suppose, careful and cautious as to how you utilize it and how you engage with people. And one of the things that we would encourage a lot would be the block button. And it's that idea that you can very easily find yourself, even if it's just like reading those types of things, or if it's like, and I've seen it where players have maybe got involved in discussions with these sort of faceless, nameless accounts. So it's one of those things. There are some huge benefits to social media, but we would even be mindful in terms of like which ones you use. And I think like Twitter, or X as they call it now, it's a bit of a cesspit. And we've seen quite a shift in people like using Instagram a lot more, because it seems to be a slightly more kind forum. But we're seeing a lot more people using things like LinkedIn, because I always think LinkedIn is like sort of, it's like Facebook if you were at work and you knew your boss was going to be reading it. But yeah, it's a huge impact, absolutely huge impact, that people who have never kicked a ball in their life are giving these elite athletes sort of feedback on performances, not knowing anything about the game.
And so if a footballer or a club would want to reach out for your services, how would they go about doing that?
Well, I suppose there's two ways. One, they could check their inbox, because I've probably already emailed them. But secondly would be, again, there's potentially through our website, which is www.willowgrove.consulting, or on all of the sort of major social media. And when I say major, I'm too old for Snapchat and TikTok and those types of things. But the rest, you can find us on at WGC Mental Health. And just drop us a message, drop us an email. We can set up and if it's on an individual basis, we can set up a consultation. We do completely free consultations where we can support people to find out a little bit about what's going on. But equally, if it's a club or an organization, again, we can set up a meeting to get some support in place.
I mean, following also just the first contact and you maybe setting up the first appointment with your client, can you lead us through the process of you just helping the player, or just maybe also the club that contacted you for help with mental health challenges that occurred?
So with any client, whether it's they've approached us on an individual basis or whether it's through one of the clubs that we work with, we would do an initial consultation, and we would develop what we call a formulation. And I like to think of formulation as, pulling as much information about the person's story together in one place, in one document. We highlight the things that are maybe going well in their life. We highlight protective factors, supportive factors, but then we also highlight, what are the presenting problems? What are the difficulties? Is it low mood? Is it anxiety? And then we try and think, is it, football related? Is it something outside work? Is it, maybe relationships, those types of things? It's very rarely one thing. It's usually a combination of factors. I always like to think of human beings. We're a subtotal of our own experiences. So once we have all that information together, that would dictate what the plan of support might be. Now, for some individuals, we might do a really structured course of maybe some work around anxiety. And we would do a lot of psychoeducation around what anxiety is, why our bodies present in this particular way, and then a range of strategies as how we can manage that. For some people, it's more of a sort of proactive and preventative measure. So there's clients who I will have maybe a monthly or 2-monthly appointment in the diary, and we will just catch up and make sure things are ticking over, make sure we're doing all of those preventative and proactive strategies. And a lot of it is around developing, I suppose, it's a bit like a training plan. If you were going into training every day, you've got your activation, you've got all your warm-ups, you've got all the drills that you're doing to focus on all of these key areas. But a huge amount of what you do as an athlete is just about keeping the body healthy, keeping it ticking over, like injury prevention. So we have that similar sort of approach in terms of our mental health as well, that let's nip things in the bud before they can become a major issue. But we would also create what we would call a RAP plan. a wellness recovery action plan. And this is, it includes information from that formulation. It also includes information as to how we can look after ourselves, how we can keep our mental health in a really good place, but also a bit around like risk management and crisis management, that if things were to take a bit of a dip, what do we do? Because what we don't want is a situation where a player is maybe seeking support with an organization like ourselves, and they sort of get to a point where they're like, all right, well, I'm doing A, B, and C, but things have taken a dip and I don't know what to do. So we'll get all of those sort of crisis management bits in as well. Now, if we were working with a club, it's a very similar approach in the sense that we would go through all of those steps. The key thing, even when we are working with a club, everything's confidential. So nothing would go back to people in the club. I've never had discussions with managers, coaches, anything like that in any of the clubs I'm working with, because one, it's none of their business, and two, it would be a major breach of confidentiality, and it would be the sort of thing that I could get struck off for. The only time that I would breach confidentiality would be if there was a risk issue, and a risk to the player themselves or to someone else. But the only other time that we would share information is if the player agreed to that. So there might be times where I would say, here, I think it might be useful to have a chat with the team doctor or the sports psychologist, which is usually my link within the club. And sometimes it would be, I would say, here, I think it would be helpful for you to have that discussion. And then we would have a discussion as to whether or not I would have that discussion with the person at the club, whether the player would have it, or whether it would be sort of all three of us involved as well. And then I suppose it's a case of depending on the, I suppose, the individual themselves, would they want that sort of work to carry on like a maintenance basis? So do they want that, a session every month, every 2 months? Or for some people, they just need a short block, and we try and sort of address the issues there and then, and off they go. But again, we're very flexible, and we're very creative as well. So we try and find what's the best fit for the individual.
I mean, also in addition to the support that you offer to players or just your clients in general, what would you say is also something that teams, clubs, or even fans can do to ensure that just football or the whole just bubble, I would say, is and remains a safe space for players and staff?
I think a lot of it is about talking and being really, really open and honest. And if we can talk about our mental health, and if we look at, and I think going back to the Lionesses in particular, they are really open about the difficulties that they have had, and they create environments where it's actually okay to talk about mental health. So I think that's one of the things, just starting to have those discussions. And what I always say to people is, you should talk about your mental health before it takes a dip, because it's a lot easier to talk about your mental health when things are in a good place. And if we think about 1 in 4 people at any one time will be struggling with their mental health, and if you're in a club, like, that's 2 or 3 people in the starting lineup. And it's that idea, if maybe people who are in a good place start talking about it, that might open the door for conversations with people who might be struggling. So I suppose that's the first thing. The second thing for me is about calling out things that aren't conducive to good mental health. And I know it's unfortunately something that I suppose I see a lot, whether it's in my day job or whether it's in my work in sport. But particularly in sport, the stories that we hear about female footballers and the environments that they're in that are incredibly toxic, and it only takes one person and to make things really, really toxic. And if anyone's been in, and it doesn't have to be an elite environment, if you've been involved in sport at any point, we've all had those experiences where 1 or 2 people have made it really, really negative. And I think there are lots of structures in place from a safeguarding perspective. And I think it's one of the things that the AFA are actually quite good at in terms of having those structures in place. But unless people are reporting these issues, unless people are calling out those issues, then they will just carry on. And we see it time and time again. And there's been a lot of high profile cases in the media where things have gotten really, really toxic at club with catastrophic consequences. So if you see something that just makes you feel a bit uncomfortable, there are ways and means of addressing that. Ideally, you want to do it within the existing structures within those clubs, but there are whistleblowing policies, and if you look on, particularly on the FA's website, they've got some really, really good resources there. But yeah, I think a case of if we can just talk about mental health but equally calling out things that are inappropriate.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. Especially with just speaking out and saying what is bothering you, because if you don't say anything, it will be hard to really get help. But already coming to an end of today's podcast episode, there's one question that we always like to ask our guests, which is that just where would you like to see, especially the women's game, just develop, or what kind of change would you like to see in the future of the women's game, also with the growth, especially?
I think, I suppose the accessibility, and I think there's been a few changes this year that I've really liked. The big one was, like, I've always been a big fan of the FA player. I've loved that in terms of being able to watch a lot of the games. But the thing I hated was I would have to watch it on my phone. Whereas now the games are all available on YouTube. It's a game changer because you can actually watch it on a big TV, and the bigger the TV, the better, in my opinion. So I think the accessibility, putting more games on at the bigger stadiums as well. I was at the Stadium of Light a couple of weeks ago. And I went, there's me and my mate went with my little boy. And for the two adults and a kid, it was 15 quid for the three tickets. It was absolutely brilliant. There was 15,000 people there. It was a brilliant day. It was really family friendly. And I think, like, I live in Sunderland. My wife is a Newcastle fan, so we ended up in the away end that day. My little boy he's got his Newcastle jersey. But it's a completely different atmosphere. It's a completely different vibe at the games. And one of the things that I thought was brilliant was, like, we were getting messages from a school saying if anyone wants tickets, we've got loads. So the clubs were putting a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of resources into getting as many people there as they possibly could. And I think it's that idea, if you build it, they will come. So that just increasing I suppose, the accessibility. But the other thing for me, and particularly around mental health, and there's a few projects I'm working on with a number of different organizations where I would like to see mental health professionals being mandatory within clubs. Now that doesn't necessarily mean you would see someone like me in a tracksuit sitting on the bench. But the example I like to give is in America, in the NBA and the WNBA, there's a requirement for every club, every franchise to have a set number of mental health professionals on the staff. And there's a requirement for having a psychiatrist on retainer. Now, I know here, because in America, that's the mental health professional side is generally filled by sports psychologists. In the UK and Ireland, for example, sports psychologists wouldn't be classed as mental health professionals. But the projects that I'm working in are trying to push for whether it's mental health nurses, psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, occupational therapists, that there would be some form of arrangement where they are embedded in clubs to such an extent that they're not necessarily on the bench, but if players, staff, they need the support, that it's a phone call or a text message with. And it's the model that, like, I've described in terms of how I work with a number of clubs, that I like to think of myself sometimes as someone once described me as a ghost, in the sense that there was a player was speaking to her physio, and the physio said, "You don't seem yourself today." And she said, "Oh, I'm just struggling with the injury. I'm feeling a bit low, but I'm speaking with Mark tonight." And they were like, "Who the hell's Mark?" And she was like, "Oh, the mental health guy." And they were like, "We have a mental health guy." And I think in some ways that was really good because it demonstrated that the confidentiality that we're able to maintain. But at the same time, wouldn't it be great if every club just had a mental health person?
Yeah.
So for me, I think, and maybe the women's game is where we can actually embed these things and show how it works. And I think the big difficulty for, I suppose, myself personally, and for other people who operate similar organizations, is we can't expect our clients to go out and sing from the rooftops that they're accessing support, because it feels uncomfortable on a number of levels in terms of confidentiality and trust and things like that. But I think if a club was able to go out and say, we've got someone here as part of our staff, and this is what we do, and this is the benefits that that people have had, whether it's players, whether it's staff, then I think it could be a bit of a game changer, and it could be a model that we could then say, well, it's working here, it's not overly expensive, and it can have a huge impact upon people's well-being. I think that would be a bit of a game changer.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Also talking about just the impact about also speaking up, because I think if you're even looking at fans and just what fans are also saying, it's always nice to see when a player or a club is speaking up about just seeking help with mental health, because then also some fans are like, oh yeah, the player that I like or the club that I support is speaking so openly about it. So I think that also especially makes younger people feel like they can talk about it, and it's not a shame to talk about mental well-being, because if you're not feeling well physically, you're going to a doctor. That's also what players have said. If you're not feeling well physically, you're going to a doctor. So why not seek help when you're not feeling well mentally?
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And I think like these players, and particularly the Lionesses, they never chose to be role models, but they find themselves in that position, and they're doing it really, really well. And like you said, I suppose it's difficult even to like single any of them out, because there's so many of them who've spoken about the difficulties they've had in terms of their mental health for lots of different reasons. And I just think it is a bit of a game changer. That when you see these people who are like their idols, their superstars talking about it, then it makes, I suppose, the rest of us think, oh well, yeah, if they can do it, if they can talk about it, they can get support, then it's okay for the rest of us to do that as well.
And hopefully the more people that talk about their mental health challenges, the more normalised it'll become, and it'll be less of a taboo subject that we often shy away from. So it's great that, you know, these players, although unfortunate that they are struggling with their mental health, it's great that they feel that they have a platform that they can use and talk about it, and just reinforce that they themselves are just like everyone else and still have their own individual struggles every day, and just normalising it. So
Yeah, 100%. I know I've seen it in, again, going back to my day job, I've seen it where I've had, and there's a number of young men who were referred to the service that I work in, and it was as a direct result of Tyson Fury talking about his mental health difficulties. And there was a number of these lads, men in their 20s, saying that yeah, it was after seeing people like Tyson Fury or Paddy Pimblett in the UFC talking about their mental health that they felt comfortable to do it. And I think women are a bit ahead of the game in that regard. And like I said, 95% of my clients are female. And again, that's, I suppose, by accident rather than design. Because in my experience, women are more likely to seek help and are more receptive. So maybe this is the gateway into changing not just women's football, but sport in general.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, especially for joining us today.